Greetings from RightsCon in Taipei, where we're joined by thousands of activists working in the area of human rights in the digital age. And with us now is Betsy Popken. Welcome to This Week in Cyberspace.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Now, Betsy is the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley School of Law, where she directs the Climate Justice Program and leads a team that's conducting human rights impact assessments and evaluations of general large language models, those golems that are taking over the world. What's the state of play? Are they really going to dominate humanity?
Well, it's interesting. We have a session today at RightsCon with 3 organizations that have produced the first public human rights assessments of generative AI. And so we're trying to tie kind of the risks and the outputs to human rights impacts. So it'll be kind of the first public presentation of impacts that Gen AI has to human populations.
And what did you find?
So, yeah.
Or is this is this embargoed?
It's not embargoed. So we had we did ours kind of focused on the use of large language models by legal professionals, journalists, and educators.
Yeah.
And we found, certain cross-cutting human rights risks and certain kind of ones that went really deep into a particular field. So education, we found freedom of thought to be a huge human rights risk because it's used to kind of circumvent typical education processes where you have to write your own paper and put thought into how you're going to structure it and what the analysis is going to be.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so that's just one example. Happy to share more.
Can we delve just a little bit into
Sure.
that? Because it is fascinating. So freedom of thought, which is Article 19 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. How do you even... So the concept is that instead of you using your own faculties, critical thinking faculties, and like having to write where the brain is kind of engaged, thought is with AI, with generative AI, is actually done for you.
Yeah, in some circumstances, if you're using Gen AI to circumvent kind of the typical research process, the typical writing process, the typical brainstorming, how you're going to structure a paper process, like that is all stuff that traditionally we all grew up learning how to do. And without that, it's kind of circumventing freedom of thought in the way that you're not kind of developing
it's not your thought. It's the algorithm's thought.
And also the assessors are marking the golem. They're marking the AI, not the actual student.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's
Remarkable.
interesting. I mean, so many of us use Gen AI day to day and, ChatGPT in our work to some extent. But it's just interesting when you think about young people growing up with this. Yes, it can be a huge opportunity if it's like widely available, but it can also have some real impacts.
And it also says that there's only one way of thinking.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
The way of the AI.
But also the crazy thing is when you think about one way of thinking, we all have this, like, did you see the movie, was it Her or She?
Her.
No.
Yes.
Which was so we all having this personal relationship with our device, but actually your relationship with your device is the same because we're all coming from the same thought. So source, which means that like whatever type of originality that you think you have is actually the same as everyone. So there's no uniqueness at all, even as good as it sounds. And not that I've been using generative AI in any of my work. All of my thinking and thought is original, just for the record.
Yeah, but your brothers, on the other hand.
I will say we did global stakeholder engagement, and it was so interesting because we found in North America and Europe, professionals tend to be very risk adverse in terms of how they use large language models in their work, whereas other parts of the world, they're not. And so the risks really varied based on where people lived, as did the opportunities.
And we've talked a lot about the inbuilt biases in generative AI and how they discriminate against women and people of color. So all that sort of stuff is inbuilt into their output.
One, language access was a huge part of it too, because we were talking to people all over the world. All of the people we interviewed also spoke English, but when we asked them, do you use it in your native language? They said, we've tried and the output is not nearly good enough.
Yeah.
So that just kind of shows also the kind of bias in terms of who can use it.
Yeah. So,
I was just going to say that prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you advised Ukraine's parliament on how to vet the public sector. What did that involve?
So, I mean, basically, I had done years ago written an article on kind of vetting of public sectors and kind of the post-conflict scenarios. And so I kind of created guidance tailored to the Ukrainian context and spoke with kind of a panel of them on kind of the what the guidance is if you're vetting a public sector of folks from kind of, for them, like the communist era that they didn't yet like want in their government anymore. Of course, that was kind of targeted towards Russian influence. But yeah, just so interesting to then see what happened. I mean, interesting and horrifying to then see kind of Russia's
full-scale invasion.
Yeah.
Do you, I mean, the amazing thing about Betsy, and I don't want to kind of disclose to the public like how amazing she is, but she has this like incredible history of engaging on peace processes, on ceasefire negotiations. Just give us a snippet of like what that's like when you're there with warring parties that are like, on the battlefield or in cyberspace, and here they are, up against, like, do they meet face to face?
So, yeah, I worked most extensively with the Syrian opposition delegation in UN mediated negotiations. Sometimes they met face to face, sometimes they met individually with the UN, but it all took place at the UN Palais in Geneva. And it depended on kind of what the relations were between them. But I would say they generally made a lot more progress when they met independently with the UN envoy.
Yeah. Who's skillfully trying to sort of edge them closer to the middle.
Right.
I mean, I've been in negotiation processes before. It's so much of it depends on like how skillful that person is.
Yes.
And trying to find some sort of common ground. When you're advising the Syrian delegation, are you kind of advising on this is a position that you could take, sort of encouraging them, or are you sort of reflecting what they want and trying to put it into legal terms?
Yeah. So more reflecting what they want and educating them.
Yeah.
So if there would be, talk of a ceasefire, it would be, this is what typically goes into a ceasefire. You have entry into force provisions, you have prohibition of activities, you have entry into, you have kind of all of these different separation of forces. And so we would do core elements memos, which explained what happened. And then we would also do comparative state practice. So, of course, no context is exactly the same as yours, but in these conflicts, this is how they approach these particular parts of it. So ceasefire, constitution drafting, the list went on and on in terms of the issues that we worked with them on.
And what happens when you have one party completely rewriting history? For instance, Trump talking about the invasion of Ukraine not being undertaken by Russia. How do you bring them around to actual reality?
Bring whom around to actual reality?
Well, in this case, I'm saying, Trump, because he's...
or even so, and Betsy, I'll get you to speak into the mic as well.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's fine. But but like as Nell said, like, do you kind of need to have
reality in the room.
Well, and bona fide partners as well, like who want to come to an agreement. But with Trump, you're seeing now him actually saying, I mean, the meeting that happened in Saudi, that prep meeting or whatever it was, is actually happened in the absence of one of the key, like the country that's been invaded. How does that work? And then I want to move to technology and how technology has impacted warfare. But
yeah. I mean, ultimately, to have a resolution to a conflict, you have to have the parties involved in the conflict, involved in the negotiation.
Yeah.
Unless another party has said, okay, you, third party state, can negotiate on my behalf.
Yeah.
But that clearly did not happen in this instance.
Yeah.
So any agreement reached between the Trump administration and Russia is not going to fly unless Zelensky can sign on to it.
Yeah.
Can I ask one more
Yeah,
question?
go.
Because it's so interesting just to
In the
get a
current
window,
context.
in the current, and get a window into. So, you actually, in the Syrian instance, the peace negotiation was actually between those two parties, the US and Russia, right? Well,
At points in time, it was.
So sort of like a proxy war that was happening in a third country, Syria, but it was really also the US and Russia that were
they
fighting,
negotiated
the superpowers, you know?
During the Geneva 3 peace talks. They actually negotiated the ceasefire in Russia and created a monitoring body of folks from the US and Russia to monitor the violations taking place. Of course, the ceasefire just lasted for a few days. We were all in New York at the UN General Assembly meeting when it busted open.
Broke,
but a lot of work went into that on both of their sides.
Yeah, it must be devastating when all that work has gone in and you just see it blow up in your face like that. Where do you begin again? How do you begin again?
Go on. I mean, we're going to speak to Hadi later today, who's from the Syrian archive. I mean, the ultimate resolution of that conflict has been a coup. Like Assad is done, which is mind blowing. And we were talking about it when it was happening, going, "What is this?" And
And one of the negotiators we worked with, very closely, Hind Kabawat, is actually one of 7 on the planning committee for the National Dialogue.
Wow!
So we're really excited, and we're still in touch with her as well.
Speaking of coups, I mean, people have been talking about what's going on in the United States as being a coup or worse than a coup. How do you view the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's not been easy for the human rights community. I think in some instances, it kind of inspires you because you are in a position to kind of stand up to, leading figures that oppose the work you do and be like, we're going to continue to support these underadvantaged communities. But it's hard. We had one grant that was terminated, another that won't come in. And so even just from an operations standpoint, it's difficult. And, we work with migrants in California, farm workers, many of whom now are just terrified about being deported.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the communities we work with, the grant that was terminated was with to create guidelines for LGBTQI plus youth in humanitarian refugee zones.
I mean, you can see, that's like all the things, LGBT,
totally.
refugees, like migrant, like done.
Slashed.
Totally.
So
all that advancement over the years and decades.
Yeah, it's absolutely frightening. Actually, Nell sent me a few weeks ago, or maybe it was last week. We kind of lost touch with time, but sort of a lawyer or a progressive analyst, a podcaster, actually talking about like what's the playbook. The first bit of the playbook is the audit. The audit, it's a financially related. Like you either starve the organizations that you're opposed of money, or you tie them up in an audit where they're instead of doing their work, they're like checking their financials and having like this extraordinary review and assessment. Let's in our final few minutes flip to the topic at hand, or one of the topics at hand. It's hard to find the topic at hand at RightsCon, but around the digitalisation of warfare, and I'd really be interested to hear from you, like having been through, sort of more traditional conflicts and trying to bind the parties in, and now seeing this advent of new technologies. How do you feel about the current frameworks that are in place, and, what the gap is, if you see it? Spoiler alert, we are, Betsy and I are working together on a digital ceasefire agreement. But I love that softball over to you. And
Thanks, Brett. So in my engagement with the Syrian opposition in negotiations, we had a number of digital hostilities take place. And, just to give an example, Facebook was initially used by protesters to mobilize in different areas. And then it was used by the government to track protesters and imprison them. So, one of the opposition negotiators who Brett and I have spoken with, she was tracked using social media. Then her social media account was used by the officials to basically prove that she had protested, and then she was imprisoned as a result for a long time. So that's just, and that was before she joined the negotiating team. In another instance, a negotiator's brother who had nothing to do with the opposition was tracked and disappeared.
Wow.
But also with the negotiators themselves during negotiations, email accounts were hacked. So the Syrian opposition had the proposal, or the Syrian regime had the proposals that the Syrian opposition had drafted and intended to submit to the UN.
Yeah.
And, and disinformation campaigns abounded. So there was one top Syrian opposition negotiator, huge disinformation campaign against her, which undermined her credibility with folks supporting the opposition. So just to show that there were a number of instances where, where digital hostilities were used to undermine kind of the work of the opposition. That said, we didn't experience at the time internet shutdowns or now cyber attacks like you see Russia committing against Ukraine. So there's a whole host of digital hostilities that we're looking at in conflict.
And do you think that there's, we might go, because this is so interesting, we might go a minute or two longer. But do you think that that international humanitarian law is like up for the challenge? Because many of these documents were like written in, I think the original document 1840 or something ridiculous. So we're dealing with 150 years of precedent, of process, of analog kind of conflicts where what largely they are talking about is like movement of troops, not movement of code. They're talking about buffer zones, not firewalls. So like, how does it update itself?
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting. The ICRC has put out statements that IHL does apply to what's going on.
International humanitarian law.
Yes, international humanitarian law. But I will say, just as in the human rights field, like we've had to add, a right to a clean and healthy environment as a human right. Yeah. That technically should fall under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and protections on kind of other rights that take place. But sometimes you need to spell it out very specifically. So I do think there's a good opportunity to update IHL to kind of specifically address the digital hostilities we're seeing in conflict.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for taking us onto the ground and into some of those situations that you've been in negotiating ceasefires around the world.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. And, just as we think to the future and we think about like how we appear to be living in a world of conflict. And I think everybody at this conference and probably, around the world is feeling this sense of foreboding that it's not just Ukraine. I mean, there's 120 conflicts brewing as we speak, but all the systems, all the frameworks, the international legal human rights, law, everything is all kind of up for grabs. So as we enter into a world that's increasingly digitalizing and a world that's increasingly, in conflict, like those two things will need to come together. And we're really looking forward to seeing where it goes and where the Human Rights Centre can take it. So thanks very much for your time.
Yeah,
thanks,
of course.
Betsy.
Thank you both.